Hello, everyone. For Easter, I thought I'd do a presentation on uh, historian's perspective on the resurrection. And this is from a Sunday school class I did a few years ago. Because the first question we should ask ourselves is a question we should really be asking ourselves all the time until we get an answer, is what happens after we die? And of course, we have the popular concept of sitting around on clouds and perhaps playing a harp or being bored. But of course, there are many other concepts. So today here we'll focus on one particular concept. And as mentioned, it's going to be an historian's perspective on the resurrection. So first, let's read from 1 Corinthians 15, written by the Apostle Paul. In it he says, "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that's Peter, "and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep." And he continues on verse 13 to say, "If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." So everything about the Christian faith hinges on the question of the resurrection. So it's easy enough to really disprove and discredit the Christian faith. Let's take a look at some objections to the idea or the claim of the resurrection. And here we see Antony Flew, but he's a British philosopher who said, you can't prove miracles from historical evidence. You just can't do that. Another objection, the historical documents of the New Testament were written 30 or more years after the event. And lastly, there's no way of knowing if Jesus actually appeared to his followers after his death. Not very controversial objections to the resurrection. Today, or at least shortly before he died, he said, "Today I would say the claim concerning the resurrection is more impressive than any by the religious competition." So something happened to him. The question is what? Flew was one of the foremost atheist philosophers for 50 years. But he eventually realized that science was pointing to the existence of God in several ways. The origin of the universe, the design of the universe, the origins of life, of mind, consciousness, and so on. There are many questions, many pointers that science was giving that was saying, we can't explain it. And not only that, it was positively pointing to the existence of a designer. So he wrote this book, and in it he invited Bishop N.T. Wright, who is a trained historian, to present his case for the resurrection from an historian's standpoint. So before we can look at the meat of it, we need to understand the foundation. We need to lay the foundation, look at the first century beliefs about life and death. And this becomes important, as you will see. So the Greco-Roman concept, they didn't have a concept of resurrection. And you can read this from, Pliny, Homer, Cicero, and so on. All right, not sure how to pronounce Aeschylus. Okay. And the concept was that after you died, you became what they call a shade. Something unsubstantial, kind of like a ghost, a phantom, without a body, or barely being able to think, if at all. And you would wait on the shore of the river Styx, and Sharon would take you over to Hades and so forth. Even those who managed to get ferried across to the underworld, they didn't have really much of a life. It's something very bleak. Now, if we look at the Jewish beliefs, at that time, and still, they believed that God's people, which would be, believing or righteous Jews and Gentiles, would be bodily resurrected, but only that would happen at the end of history, at the end of time. Now, of course, the Pharisees believed this, and the Sadducees did not. That's why they were sad, you see. Okay, anyway. The Essenes, they believed in a disembodied sort of immortality. Again, kind of like a soul or spirit or a ghost. So we have to understand that these were the forms of belief about life after death during the time of Christ. So we are faced with some surprises. Surprise number one, well, first, we know that from history, when faced with death, people tend to revert or be very conservative about their beliefs. You wouldn't make a last-minute change on your deathbed. You would just tend to stick with what you had been going by your whole life. However, all the early Christians, at least through the late 2nd century, believed in a future bodily resurrection, even though most of them had been pagans. To them, it would have been, in the words of, I guess, Antony Wright, utter rubbish to believe in a future bodily resurrection. Remember, they believed mostly in a shady, ghostly afterlife. So here's another surprise. People in the 1st century, of course, we know they were not entirely readily believing in the resurrection because, well, first of all, the simple reason is people back then had kind of the same outlook on miracles as we do. We tend to believe that they were more gullible, but if we think about their reaction to the story of the virgin birth, we see that Joseph didn't believe Mary's story about being becoming pregnant through God's power, and he was going to divorce her. They just weren't that dumb. They were skeptical. They knew that how babies were made. We may be surprised to find that they're just as human as us in that respect. And if you think that we're less prone to believing crazy things today, that's another discussion. So number 3, changes to classic Jewish beliefs about the resurrection. So first of all, it happened to one person in advance, as opposed to everyone at the end of time. Another surprise is it will involve transformation of our physical body. We won't have the same kind of body, and we won't become like shining stars, whatever that might mean, and we'll see what that means later. But we will have a new kind of physical body, physical and solid, but also free of suffering and death. Now, another surprise belief that the Christians had was that Messiah, Jesus, was raised from the dead. And this is especially a surprise because no one expected him to die in the first place. So these are all changes to the classic Jewish beliefs, which again, become very important a little bit later. Surprise number 4. The idea of resurrection, instead of being associated with the idea of the Jewish people returning from exile, the primary interpretation of Ezekiel chapter 37, the Valley of Dry Bones, now is used in connection with the ideas of baptism and holiness and so forth. So all this talk of resurrection is taken very differently from how it used to be interpreted in the time of Jesus. Surprise number 5. For the Christians, instead of resurrection being just one doctrine among a whole bunch of others, now everything hinges on it. Now it's the center, right? Just as Paul said. Surprise number 6. In early Christianity, there's no variation of belief in what happens after you die. So if we compare this to various, all the milieu of beliefs going around at the time, there were all kinds of, little differences here and there on what they held. But for the church, the early church, they all believed the same thing. And this is, historically, this is something which is very hard to explain. If you look at the New Testament writings, you'll see that the early church had many disagreements on all kinds of stuff, what to eat or what to do with the Gentiles, what laws they were to follow or not to follow. But on this crazy idea of the resurrection, there was no disagreement. And that's not what you would expect if this was something that was made up, if it was some kind of idea that they came up with and it evolved over time. So the historian would have to ask, why did all the early Christians have this new unanimous view of resurrection when there were so many other things, that they had little disagreements about? If this idea of this resurrection was added, okay, in quotation marks, 20 or 30 years later, we would expect many variations, right? Just like all, many other religious things that people might believe. There would be many, many forms of it. So let's look at the Gospels. We see that there's discussions, of course, arising from the liberal scholarship, that the Gospels were written in the 30s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, trying to push it back further and further as possible. But in the argument we're looking at, it doesn't matter. So we'll see that from the viewpoint of professional historians, and when we say that, we mean people who don't have an axe to grind. The resurrection narratives that we find in the Gospels and the letters of the New Testament all have certain key features that tell us, as historians, that we're looking at a very, very early and mostly unedited, raw oral tradition. So let's see why that is. So one of the features that we look at is that there's a really unexpected portrait of Jesus. So the usual story is that Mark was written first. These are the theories, the scholars have about the Gospels, because it has the least material about the resurrection. And then Matthew was written next, and there's a little bit more material about the resurrection, but not much. And then Luke and John were written later, and they have more stories, and they're added to fight back against heresies that Jesus wasn't really human or that he wasn't really physical. Of course, in Luke and John, we can look at stories that talk about Jesus eating food, physical food, for example, to prove that he had a physical body, right? So the claim is that stuff like that was added later to combat heresies. Well, any problems with this view? Some of you might recognize this type of despair from watching soccer when your team scores its own goal. And so the problem with this theory is that some of these same narratives, have Jesus going through locked doors, right? Just appearing in the middle of the room. Sometimes Jesus is recognized, sometimes he is not. What's going on with that, right? If he's got a normal physical body, what is the problem? And he seems to be appearing and disappearing at will, again in non-standard ways of physical bodies. And we have him ascending into heaven. So if these narratives are written as polemics to defend against claims that Jesus was not having a physical body after his resurrection, then they've put in too much spooky stuff and they've scored an own goal. And apparently didn't notice it for decades. So let's ask ourselves, what would a first century faker do? What if you had to make up a story about the resurrection? The obvious place to look for material about the resurrection would be Daniel 12. In the book of Daniel, where it's written that the righteous will shine like stars. And we might expect descriptions of Jesus shining like a star or something like that. So we do actually find stuff like this in the so-called lost gospels. Okay, we find all kinds of crazy stories about a huge cross coming out of the tomb, and the soldiers and priests, seeing Jesus and being dazzled by his appearance and stuff like that. Stuff that you might make up yourself if you had to invent the story of the resurrection. So, from an historian's perspective, what we read in the Gospels about the resurrection is entirely unexpected, entirely unprecedented. And we have the sense that something strange has happened that has left its mark. Something they couldn't quite figure out at the time, but at the same time, they had to acknowledge and try to describe and record in separate eyewitness accounts. Now, of course, if you've read the Gospels, you've noted that the resurrection stories in each Gospels are actually kind of different. Now, some point to this and say, well, that shows that, it's just all made up. They couldn't agree on what happened. But is this a bug or a feature? Let's look at this. Another feature of the resurrection accounts is the dog that didn't bark. So if you've read the Gospel of Matthew, this is something you'll see all the time. This happened in order that the scripture may be fulfilled that says, such and such. So Matthew's pointing back to the Old Testament and saying, well, this thing in the Old Testament was fulfilled in what Jesus did here or there. But when we get to the resurrection, there's none of this stuff. Of course, it's not that difficult to go back to the Old Testament and say, well, here's the stuff that points towards the resurrection. But at the time Matthew wrote his gospel, for some reason, they didn't add any of this stuff in. In other words, it was so important to preserve these eyewitness accounts that no one wanted to mess with them. And although at first reading, we might just say, hey, these accounts are all a bit different, they don't quite match up, they don't fit together, to the historian, it says something very different. It says that something definitely happened here that is so momentous, and we can try to find out what it is. Witnesses telling slightly different stories is just real life. It's real life. And if we compare this to the crucifixion accounts and the burial accounts, where he does have this stuff, these references back to the Old Testament, it becomes very strange. So keep that in mind. In John 20, verse 9, and actually if we go a little bit before that, we see the disciples running to the tomb. And it talks about Simon Peter came following the first guy, and he went into the tomb. They saw the linen cloths lying there. And then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. But then, John doesn't tell us what the scripture is. We're left kind of hanging. And then we look at Luke 24, verse 27, where it talks about scriptures telling us about the Messiah. He doesn't tell us which ones. Again, very, very strange. What's going on here? Why is this happening? And again, in Luke, it's where Jesus is talking to a couple of disciples on the road to Emmaus. And it says, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And Luke doesn't tell us. So, and of course, these days we have a good idea, but it's just kind of again a cliffhanger. So let's look at this from the historian's perspective. Either the early church wrote these stories with the Old Testament allusions and references, and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John removed these references, or these stories are based on a very early oral tradition before there was time for them to think about it, in depth, and figure out, oh yeah, this was prophesied in the Old Testament, in such and such. So these stories are just in a very, very raw form because they were just so important and so foundational that they were left basically as is, and we can see clues for that. Now, in the Gospels, you'll see that the earliest witnesses of the empty tomb were women, right? You see Mary and so forth going there very, very early to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body. But if you look in 1 Corinthians 15, written in the early 50s, Paul doesn't even mention the women. Why? Well, again, in the Jewish world, in the pagan world, really, in that time, women were not considered credible witnesses. So in Corinthians, where Paul is listing witnesses to Jesus and the empty tomb, he doesn't even mention them because he knows his readers will say, "Wait a minute, a bunch of women saw this. It doesn't really help me." But there they are in the gospel accounts. And not only that, the prime witness in all four accounts is Mary Magdalene. Now, we have to remember that Mary Magdalene was someone from whom Jesus exorcised, cast out several demons. Now, it doesn't matter whether you believe it, but it does matter that the early church believed this. She's seen as kind of a sketchy character by a lot of people, and being possessed again. Not good a resume for credibility. So all these features of the Gospels, as Wright puts it, it's like shooting themselves in the foot. To historians, this kind of thing, are huge clues to something else, like gold dust to historians. And you can hopefully see by now that the early Christians would never, never have made this up. Especially, women being the prime and first witnesses. They would never have just invented the story about the women being such key players. So, what does Jesus' resurrection usually mean to us today? Now, the Gospels don't say Jesus has been raised, therefore we'll be raised. Instead, what it says is, therefore he was the Messiah, and we have work to do. Again, this is very different from our, these perspectives we get in the other writings in the New Testament, which were done later. And it seems, from the historian's perspective, this is because the narratives were written so early, the resurrection narratives in the Gospels, that they hadn't figured out what it all means, and they couldn't put in their commentary. So we can come to some conclusions. Of course, that the early church really believed Jesus had been bodily raised from the dead. So it's not even to say was it true, but all we have to know is that the early church really believed this. Okay, and then how do we explain this as historians? So for this to have been the case, two things must have happened. The first, there must have been an empty tomb, and it must have been the correct one. Okay, so one theory that's put forth decades ago was, they all ran to the wrong tomb. Of course, the authorities would have known which tomb was the right one, and just simply pointed people to it and said, well, there it is, his body's still there. So it must have been the correct one. There must have been appearances of the risen Jesus. Now keep in mind, we don't have to prove that they saw the risen Jesus. The only thing that matters is that they thought and they were convinced that they had experienced appearances of the risen Jesus. Why is this the case? Well, let's look at possible scenarios. Empty tomb, but no appearances. What's the explanation? Well, obviously, grave robbers. Or perhaps, what if the authorities removed the body? Well, in that case, they would have simply produced the body once all the hubbub had begun. What if we had appearances, but the tomb was not empty? Well, simply, of course, we would say that the appearances, yeah, they were nice, but he's there, he's in the tomb, so thanks for nothing. And the other thing that they knew back then was pretty much people don't come back from the dead. In a couple of instances in the Old Testament, it happened, way back. But generally speaking, everybody knew that this kind of thing just didn't happen. Right? No matter how religious you were, no matter how superstitious you were, it just didn't happen. They knew all about stuff like, dreams and visions, hallucinations and ghosts, So if the tomb was not empty, it's got to be one of those. Right? Both of those must have happened. And so from the historian's perspective, there must have been an empty tomb, and there must have been appearances of the risen Christ. Even though there were some things that you didn't quite understand, what was going on, these two things must have happened. Here we come to the dilemma. How do I explain this as a historian? And if those two things happened, and at this point it's hard to find any serious historians who actually dispute that these two things were true. One, that the tomb was empty, and two, that the disciples were convinced that they had seen the risen Christ. The most logical explanation, by far, is Jesus was actually raised from the dead. Now remember, we're just talking about logic here. And many, many other explanations have been explored, and all of them have come to grief, for various logical and historical reasons. So, how do we react to this? Well, yeah, but there has to be some other explanation. Believe me, there have been many, many attempts to provide other explanations, but really, again, the most logical one is that Jesus really rose from the dead. This is N.T. Wright's argument for the resurrection from an historian's perspective, and I hope it's been interesting to you, and that you can see that God has crafted the events concerning the resurrection, how it is recorded, and the flow of history, and the times in which Jesus lived, and all the prevailing beliefs about the afterlife, and the fact of the women being the first witnesses, and so forth, all adding up to the conclusion that the best explanation is that two of those things happened. The tomb was empty, and there were appearances of Jesus risen, and the best explanation being his bodily resurrection. Okay, well, think about what this means for you.